Okay, so I've been running a little bit behind. Today I want to do this quick video on the discussion for week 3. Now, many of you did not do the discussion for week 3. In fact, most of you did not do it because you were doing the CTE that was required, which is fine. But you still need to understand this information because it's formative to everything we're going to do coming forward, especially since this is the big one about economics. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint and hit these points as I can. I encourage you to please pay attention to this information and to have a good working knowledge of it because it's going to be on the final exam. When I ask you questions about the historical development of capitalism, you're going to need to understand what's going on in this video. Look, there was a big hint right there. So hopefully you're paying attention to this video. All right, so economic changes 1450 to 1750. The big questions: what is wealth? How is the idea of wealth changing in the period from 1450 to 1750 throughout the world, not just in Western Europe, but throughout the world? How does it impact the common man, and does it affect the common man? Does wealth trickle down? How is it related to technological advancements? How does it relate to the Columbian Exchange? Which societies benefit from the new wealth and which suffer? Is this new distribution of wealth and power the basis for racism and slavery? Why or why not? Okay. Again, pretty straightforward. And I'm going to remind you, your final exam, which is 15% of your final grade, these are the kind of questions you're going to have on it. So you need to be thinking about that as you're doing these discussions or as you're actively choosing not to do these discussions. Be sure you bear in mind that the final exam questions are going to be a lot like these. All right, so what is wealth? Many of you went to dictionaries and other places to look up wealth, even your textbooks. Most of you didn't actually cite where you got that definition, which is kind of annoying since we need to be citing everything that comes from another source. I went to Investopedia to find my definition of wealth because I think it's a really great online resource. They do a lot with the history of finance, the history of economics. Obviously, in this case, this is from one of their basic things. What is wealth? It is an accumulation of valuable economic resources that can be measured in terms of either real goods or monetary value. Net worth is the most common measure of wealth, determined by taking the market value of all physical and intangible assets owned, then subtracting all debts. And that's pretty standard. If you go to an accountant today and you want to figure out what you're worth, that's what they're going to tell you. Look at what you have, look at what you can do, as in your potential labor or your potential creativity, what the current market value for that is, and then subtract what you owe. And there you go. That's what your net wealth is. For our purposes, of course, wealth is changing, and that's a big point of why we put it in this 300-year period. From the beginning of civilizations and even technically continuing on, the real value of wealth has been determined by control of land, and that is because the ability to produce food has been the basis that every society has focused on. If you go all the way back to the ancient civilizations, in fact, even the very first civilizations, a big part of what they were trying to do was to acquire more and more land, and the people on that land to work that land to produce food. And where wealth came from was when a society had enough food that it could create a surplus thereof, so that a certain percentage of the population did not have to literally be in food production. This is where you get your kings, your queens, your 10 to 20% of the population that were not literally working on producing food. By the time we get to the 1400s, it's a slightly higher percentage of people who are not having to be involved in actual food production, and in fact going into what we refer to as the early modern age. There was an agricultural revolution. This was in the 12, 13, 1400s. Throughout the world, people were able to produce more food and thus have more surplus, which is part of what we get to the Indian Ocean trade networks and why it was working so well, and of course why the Europeans wanted to get into them. For the Europeans themselves, though, and this is a big part of where the issue of the Columbian Exchange ties in, the control of the Western Hemisphere allowed them to exchange more food products from the east to the Western Hemisphere and from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere. And this exchange will markedly ramp up how much food could be produced, the excess of it that could be produced, um, and with the new goods, the fact that you could take tired land like that in Europe, put new food products on it that actually grew well. So you basically kind of doubled your land size. It also is going to allow for more specialization with the ability to move goods back and forth or to do different plants in different places. You could optimize what was being grown in a specific place to create these cash crops, as we call them, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. But you're kind of doing the same thing in Europe as well. In fact, just to give you an example, we think of Ireland as the place from which potatoes came because potatoes adapted very quickly to the Irish soil and the Irish climate and revitalized Ireland. But potatoes actually came from South America. They were something that the Incans had produced. They were literally um, toxic when they were first harvested. And what the Incas had to do was plant them in the ground literally for a year so that the soil in the ground would leach out the toxins in the potatoes so they could eat them. Europeans took the potato that the Incans had, took it back to Ireland where they discovered that just planting it, um, it worked fine. Because Ireland's a colder climate, it grew better there, it leached the toxins out early on so that you didn't have to replant it in order to eat it. And this is part of why Ireland becomes one of the cultural centers, agricultural centers for the potato, and why we associate it so much with Ireland today. Same applies to Idaho, where it is moved after Europeans start expanding into the Western Hemisphere, and then after the United States becomes independent and settlers begin to move westward, Idaho becomes a great place for potato growing. So this influx of foodstuffs and other things, both into the Western Hemisphere and from the Western Hemisphere into the Eastern Hemisphere, changes the whole nature of land and its value. It now takes less land to grow the foods that people need to survive, and thus fewer people. So what we get then is the creation of this cash crop industry that is principally things that are not food products that people have to have. Sugar, tobacco, rice. Well, rice is something people have to have, but now that can be grown in the Western Hemisphere and taken back to Eurasia. And it's actually cheaper to do that because the amount that you can grow in the Western Hemisphere versus what you were growing in the Eastern Hemisphere. Coffee, silk, flax, plants and animals that can now be commodified for profit as opposed to just for necessity. And this escalates trade as now being the new basis of wealth. It's still what you can produce, but it's also mass production. And within that, the ability to specialize in those cash crops, making it cheaper for people to actually buy them from traders than to produce them themselves. That's a big part of where this economy is changing. All right, again, very much driven by the Columbian Exchange. All right, how does it affect the common man? Does it affect the common man? Well, the answer here is yes and no. It affects the common men because common men are still doing the majority of the labor in producing any of these things, whether it's cash crop or food or whatever. Certainly, it creates the class system in Eurasia. It maintains the class system in Eurasia. If you were an agricultural worker prior to 1450, you're probably still going to remain an agricultural worker after 1450 or after 1750, unless you are one of the people for whom the enclosure movement and the sudden discovery by the aristocracy that even though they have land, that land is now no longer as valuable as the trade goods are. And so they start trying to find ways to make their land and their control of land valuable. And one of those ways is by kicking serfs and peasants off of it. So it's going to end literally the feudal system in Europe. Um, in which case, then poor people are going to be moved now into urban areas, and it's going to increase the urban population. It's going to create this construct of poverty as we recognize it today, people who can't afford to feed themselves, and they can't do it because they can't find jobs. This is also part of why when the Industrial Revolution comes along, it's going to start in large urban areas because you already have several generations of people who were previously serfs now living in these urban areas and struggling to survive. With mercantilism, a big thing we need to talk about, this also is going to make things worse for the common man. Now, while mercantilism itself tends to be this idea that trade is good, and trade is good, mercantilism is a state-sponsored, a state-mandated economy in which the whole idea behind it is that the government, particularly the kings, are going to be trying to make more and more profit off of trade. And the way they do this is by deciding that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world, which is, of course, fascinating, given that, at this point in time, they're extracting great amounts of wealth out of the Western Hemisphere. But the Western European kingdoms and empires determine that there's a finite amount of wealth, and therefore the way that you win the game of empires is by having more wealth come into your empire than is going out, which means you want to establish what we today refer to as a favorable balance of trade. If you pay attention to the news and they're talking about tariffs and the like, this is directly what that's speaking to. The idea is that you want to sell more than you buy. You want to bring wealth into the empire by selling your stuff and not buying stuff from the other guys. The way that the governments between the 1450s and the 1750s did this, and actually into the 1800s, was by mandating that the colonies could not sell anything without permission, express permission from the mother country. In fact, England made all goods go back to the mother country. If you were in North America and you were producing tobacco, you yourself could not sell it to anybody except English merchants, who would then turn around and negotiate with the government to sell it out to other empires. The way they did this is by placing very heavy taxation on anything that was bought by their own merchants. So they tax their own people very heavily. They tax the common man very heavily in hopes of controlling this and making people buy stuff within the empire, not buying it from outside. And this is going to lead to a decline in the standard of living for most people who were not already wealthy. So it's also eventually, as you are currently working on, hopefully, discussion 5, it's also going to lead to, in many ways, the Atlantic revolutions, because it's a lot of these wealthy people who are not in the aristocracy and who are not in the nobility who are going to begin to resent the fact that they are being taxed for their efforts and for their production. And they're not able to sell their stuff where they want to sell it. And again, this is that flip between mercantilism and capitalism. All right, so for the common men, yeah, in some respects, it's going to be helpful because this new wealth is going to lead them to being able to find more diverse foodstuffs due to the Columbian Exchange. But inversely, their standard of living is going to go down because their income is going to go down as they get taxed more and as they are relegated to continuing to work the land or not working the land as the enclosure movements force them off of the land. All right. So does wealth trickle down? And I say this, the phrase trickle down is a very modern phrase. It's the idea that if rich people have money, they're going to spend that money by creating more ways to make money. And because of that, the money is eventually going to trickle down to the common people who get hired by them. There's a problem with this in this period, and that problem is, again, mercantilism. As Cordas says, and I used Cordas because all of you have access to Cordas. I could have used Brooks as well. Mercantilism affected the relationship not only between countries, but also between classes. For instance, it elevated the interests of merchants and manufacturers over those of workers and consumers by arguing that wages should be kept low. More money would thus remain in employers' hands, and people would be discouraged or prevented from buying luxury goods that could instead be exported for profit. It would also, as a subtext here, encourage workers to buy cheaper goods because they didn't have the money to buy the more expensive goods, and those cheaper goods would be the ones manufactured at home as well. Mercantilists also advocated high taxes to enrich governments. The perceived need to extract raw materials from the colonies to benefit the home country's interests often led governments to restrict colonies' economic growth and harshly punish people who sought to evade tax restrictions. I'm going to point you to those people who created the United States, most of whom were illicitly selling lots and lots of goods to the French particularly. The desire to exploit American colonies also led to the abuse of indigenous populations and enslaved Africans in efforts to extract as much wealth as possible. So yes, here you are. Does it trickle down? No, not really. Not in this sense. All right, so how is it related to technological advancements? A lot of you got to this, but this is also where we're going to bring in Harari. Now, for those of you who didn't use Harari and Frankopan, two of the required sources for this week, that's going to be a problem. But this question literally goes straight to Harari. That's part of why I put it in there. If you read the chapter on Harari, it is all about the relationship between government and the scientific and Enlightenment revolutions, and how they are driven literally by government investment and why they are. Harari does a great job basically saying that for the first time in civilizational history, this is where government suddenly discovered that investing in knowledge is a good thing. It's where it first gets tied together, and it's done principally in the West. If you're looking for reasons for why Western Europeans won the game of empires against the East, this is pretty much it. And this guy right here is pretty much it. This is Isaac Newton. He's one of my favorite of the enlightened thinkers, because he's the one who literally figures out that mathematics are the basic language of all of nature. And within that, that is something that humans can learn. So the quote from Harari, for example, in the 16th century, kings and bankers channeled enormous resources to finance geographical expeditions around the world, but not a penny for understanding child psychology. This is because kings and bankers surmised that the discovery of new geographical knowledge would enable them to conquer new lands and set up trade empires, whereas they did not see any profit in understanding child psychology. Right there. Governments figured out wealth could come from knowledge, and thus they began to support and encourage learning things. Newton and mathematics, again, literally the point at which Western science is going to take off and come to dominate everywhere else. Probability and statistics, he does a really good job on pages 256 to 258 talking about the Anglican Widows and Orphans Fund, basically. It's really cool, and how they could figure out using probability and statistics how to calculate how much that was going to cost. Bacon and his whole idea that knowledge is power, but that knowledge can't just be esoteric knowledge. It's got to be usable knowledge, knowledge that you can use to do something with. And probably and perhaps my favorite part in this chapter, and one of my favorite concepts in the course as a whole, Harari talks about progress. Now, progress is one of those words that I hate, because people like to throw it out there as if we all have the same definition of it, and we don't. Progress he defines as one of the characteristics of the modern world. It's what makes us different today from the people who lived from effectively 1500 back. And that's because for many of those people, they didn't think that the world could get any better than it was then. In fact, actually, for many people going into 1500, they believed that the golden heyday of civilization had already peaked, that humanity was on the downslide. But the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and guys like Isaac Newton made us come to understand that we can make the quality of life for the average person better. And that is what progress is. It is finding new ways to do that. Harari talks about poverty. He talks about several other conditions that are intrinsic to the human nature that we now today think are things we can move past, that we can conquer. And that mindset, that idea that these are problems to be solved, not qualities that will always be with us. That is the difference between the modern world and the world before that, and part of why we start the course in this pre-modern and modern world. Frankopan also addresses this, but for him, unlike Harari, who kind of comes across somewhat optimistically in this chapter, Frankopan discusses Europe and its eventual domination of the world as a reflection of the violence that's endemic in Western society. So on page 253 in the required chapter for him, he talks about technological advances, but he talks about them in terms of weaponry. Thus, while the focus normally falls on the investment in art and impact of new wealth on culture in the 16th and 17th centuries, it is perhaps more instructive to look at the parallel advances in weapon making in this period. And with that, a big part of what he's talking about is that a lot of people who are making money drive the explosion of creativity, particularly in painting and in the arts in this period. This is why we think of people like Vermeer and Van Gogh and a lot of these 16th and 17th century artists as this being a new period in art. It is a new period of art because so many more artists now are being sponsored by wealthy people, people that have money, and they want to decorate their homes with really beautiful things. Frankopan says, yeah, it's good. It is definitely a reflection of this explosion of wealth. But he then looks at another area, weaponry, which is not just what governments are doing, but it's what people, individual people, are doing. Just as paintings were produced in enormous quantities for a hungry audience, so too were guns. By the 1690s, some 600,000 flintlocks were being sold by the entrepreneur Maximilien Titton in central France alone. In central France alone. Some contemporaries thought it was impossible even to estimate how many workers were employed in the handgun industry in Saint-Étienne because they were so numerous. Okay, so here's an example of what's happening to a lot of those people who had previously been serfs when they get kicked off the land by the aristocrats who want to do away with feudalism. Many of them are moving to urban areas like Saint-Étienne, where they go to work making guns. Between 1600 and 1750, the rate of successful fire of handguns multiplied by a factor of 10. Technological advances, including the invention of ramrods, paper cartridges, and bayonets, made guns cheaper, better, quicker, and more deadly. He then goes on to discuss the way governments become involved in this. The thirst for military confrontation lay behind other developments that were closely related to warfare, such as those in finance. Governments in Europe were hungry for capital to fund armies, leading to the establishment of debt markets where money could be raised against future tax revenues. Betting on success could produce handsome profits and unlock titles and other social benefits for canny investors whose investment in government debts could naturally be presented as patriotism. Investing in state finances was a way of getting ahead as well as becoming rich. London and Amsterdam became global centers of finance, specializing in sovereign debt, but also in increasingly complex stock market listings. Okay, this is your key. There are two keys in here that I want to go to. One is right here. complex stock market listings. This is the move towards capitalism. This is getting away from mercantilism towards the idea that individuals could pool their money together into companies or corporations and invest in ships and in um, products that could be used to make more money. John Green kind of talks about this in that video we watched back in week 1, the one about the Indian Ocean trade, that with the monsoon winds, they could predict when ships were going to be able to cross the oceans one way or the other and bring goods. It was more stable. Insurance comes from that predictability as well. Those probability charts and statistical data that are being created in this period. Again, not just an indication that it's happening in Western Europe, but throughout the world, but also in terms of Western Europe, the move towards insurance for the movement of goods gave investors a little more security in investing. So this is going to be a big part of how we're going to see this slow transition from mercantilism to capitalism and the encouragement of the wealthy to invest some of their profits in other enterprises, other companies, and other corporations. Another thing I want to point out is right here. Handsome profits and unlocked titles for social benefits. As I mentioned, aristocrats in this period are beginning to see their value decline. They have control of land, but that land is not making money for them the same way that trade and the production of cash crops are making money for them, which is a big part of why feudalism is beginning to end. Inversely, merchants are making a lot of money, but they don't have the social prestige that aristocrats do because they don't have those titles. So what we start seeing happen in the 16 and 1700s is that wealthy people began to buy titles and they began to buy manor houses and other areas that aristocrats are willing to sell because they need the money. So you begin to see these two groups kind of merging and trading off, as it were, ways to benefit each other. Aristocracy still plays a big role, even as we're talking about Enlightenment ideas like the emergence of democracy. In almost all Western societies, you still have a group of people at the top. In England, they're best manifested in what's called the House of Lords. People who are born into positions of government simply because of the hereditary nature of aristocracy. Kings can't get rid of that quickly. They're trying. They are doing things like creating bureaucratic roles in government in order to get things done. Tax collectors. They're creating standing armies so that those armies are loyal to them and to the government, not to aristocrats themselves. They're trying to streamline a lot of this. And in fact, one of the big groups that benefits through this period are going to be these bureaucratic structures that come into play at the expense of aristocrats. But at the same time, a lot of the people running them still want the privilege and title that comes from these social structures that allow aristocrats to still have this prestige. All right, moving on to the next. So then, which societies benefit from the new wealth and which suffer? Well, benefit, of course, is going to go to Western Europeans, because they're quickly emerging as the dominant group. They are imposing colonization upon the Western Hemisphere, but they are also beginning to colonize into South Asia, Southeast Asia, into Central Asia as well. The rising merchant and middle class definitely benefiting, as we just pointed out, having wealth but no land, trying to acquire land as well. Kings and rulers and their families who are going to optimize their position at the top of the scale. In the colonies, the elite are going to optimize. We have a new area of middle management in the colonies, the plantation management. These are the overseers and people like that who are going to get paid basically to make sure that the plantation is making money. And then, as I mentioned just now, bureaucrats like tax collectors, like the image at the bottom, people who work for governments and get paid wages, but those wages are going to be good wages to do that work so that they are not out trying to invest in other things. Those are the people who are going to benefit from the new wealth. People who are going to suffer? Africans, of course, and indigenous peoples throughout the world. Not just the Native Americans, but also the indigenous peoples of India and of Southeast Asia, who are going to be forced by their rulers um, to produce cash crops and things that the Westerners want, and that the Westerners want to buy. One of the things that Europeans do is they go into places like India and into Malaysia and into Southeast Asia, and they buddy up to rulers and they buy them off by giving them weapons or by selling them luxury commodities at cheap prices in return for those areas producing raw resources for them, to the point that quite often the rulers will force their people to produce cash crops instead of the food crops that they need to eat. This is going to lead to famines in India over the 16, 17, and 1800s. It's going to lead to people starving to death in other parts of the world as well. Aristocrats suffer because they're being cut out. As I just said, they may be land rich, but they're cash poor, and they've suddenly got to adapt to this new economy that they're not a part of. Serfs, again, being forced off the land. Many will become a big part of that urban poor that we were just talking about. Slaves, obviously, and indentured servants. Many of the urban poor in Europe are literally people who are forced to come to the Western Hemisphere as indentured servants because they don't have any other way to provide for themselves. And the poor throughout the world as a whole, who are going to see their standard of living decline. All right, so is this new distribution of wealth and power the basis for racism and slavery? Why or why not? I don't think there's really any way you can say no to this. It's very much the basis of racism and slavery. And this is going to be our short history in the history of race, as it were. For this part, I picked a multimedia that I like a lot, the Museum of African American History and Culture. It is one of the Smithsonian museums. They have a wonderful website, which is linked in the Works Cited page. And they have a really good history of racism written by an African American historian, David Roediger. Taking excerpts from his piece, the term race, used infrequently before the 1500s, was used to identify groups of people with a kinship or group connection. The modern day use of the term race, identifying groups of people by physical traits, appearance, or characteristics, is entirely a human invention that starts literally after the 1500s. During the 17th century, European Enlightenment philosophers based their ideas on the importance of secular reasoning, rationality, and scientific study, as opposed to faith-based religious understandings of the world. Philosophers and naturalists were categorizing the world anew and extending such thinking to the people of the world. I want to stop for just a second here and remind you of Harari's point in his chapter, which was about ignorance and how one of the things that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution do is make Westerners aware that what they don't know is actually important. The recognition of ignorance is a very big step towards the acceptance of research and experimentation and of finding out and beginning to understand the things we don't know. Prior to the scientific revolution, everyone believed in what religion told them, which basically, if religion couldn't answer the question, then it wasn't important. It was not an important question. But the rationalists of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment said no. Just because it's not answered by religion doesn't mean that it's not an important question. And that's a big part of where this new categorization, this new trying to understand the world has come from. These new beliefs, which evolved starting in the late 17th century and flourished through the late 18th century, the 16 and 1700s, argued that there were natural laws that govern the world and human beings. Over centuries, the false notion that white people were inherently smarter, more capable, and more human than non-white people became accepted worldwide. This categorization of people became a justification for European colonization and subsequent enslavement of people from Africa and from other places. Again, indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere and indigenous peoples throughout the world. Within the first decades of the 1600s, the first Africans were captured and brought to the American colonies as enslaved labor. Most colonies by that point had made enslavement legal. And we're talking about not just the colonies of the British in North America, we are talking about the Spanish colonies, we're talking about the Portuguese colonies, we're talking about all the colonies in the Western Hemisphere. At this time in colonial America, enslaved Africans were just one source of labor. The English settler used European indentured servants and enslaved indigenous people as other forms of coerced labor. These groups of enslaved and forced labor often worked side by side and commingled socially. The notion of enslavement changed throughout the 1600s. In this early period, enslavement was not an automatic condition, nor did it uniformly apply to all African and African-descended people. Very importantly, being enslaved was not necessarily a permanent lifetime status. The boundaries between groups were more fluid, but began to shift over the next few decades to make strict distinctions, which eventually became law and which eventually became focused on identifying people of color as slaves. By the late 1600s, significant shifts began to happen in the colonies. As the survival of European immigrants increased, there were more demands for land and the labor needed to procure wealth. Indentured servitude lost its attractiveness as it became economically less profitable to utilize servants of European descent. White settlers began to turn to slavery as the primary source of forced labor in many of the colonies. African people were seen as more desirable slaves because they brought advanced farming skills, carpentry, bricklaying skills, as well as metal and leatherworking skills. Characterizations of Africans in this early period of colonial America were mostly positive, and the colonists saw their future as dependent on this source of labor. So effectively what happens is that by the time we get to the late 1700s, or late 1600s, race is definitely associated with slavery and justified with the idea, and some of this actually comes from the Enlightenment. There's this really interesting Enlightenment philosopher called the Comte, C-O-M-T-E, the Count de Buffon, literally buffoon, who argued that people of color, whether it be Africans or Native Americans or even Southeast Asians, were darker skin toned because they lived in warmer climates. And those warmer climates made them lazier. And because they were lazier by nature, they were also less intelligent by nature because they hadn't had to figure out ways to do things because nature handed them everything they needed. And so because of this, they were inherently inferior, and this justified enslaving them and making them do forced labor because you were actually helping them out. Yeah, the Enlightenment has a very dark side as well, and some of that dark side was the justification for treating people horribly, literally quite horribly. All right, this is a really great image, little chart from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is my Works Cited page, and I'm showing it to you for two reasons. The first one is so that you understand what a Works Cited page is supposed to look like. It is supposed to be alphabetical by your author's last name. And as with all Works Cited, it's supposed to be author, title, date, location. If it is a book, as Frankopan and Harari are, it should be the author, the title, and because it is a book, the title is going to be italicized, the date of publication, the location of publication, and the publisher. If it is a website, as in the Investopedia, it is going to be the author. In this case, the author of Understanding Wealth, How It is Defined and Measured was the Investopedia team. It was published or updated August 20th, 2024, so you're going to use the most recent date for an update. It is located or published by Investopedia, which is an online source located at investopedia.com, and the specific link to Understanding Wealth, How Is It Defined and Measured, is this one. I used, as I mentioned before, the textbook from OpenStax, World History Volume 2, edited by Cordas, Ryan Lynch, Brooke Nelson, excuse me, and Julie Tatlock. It is a book You can download an actual copy of it, or you can buy a hard copy of it. It is World History Volume 2 from 1400. Its publication date is this year, not because it was published this year, because it is again updated regularly, and the last updates were this year. It is located at OpenStax, openstax.org, and this is the actual link to the book itself. Now, taking you back up here to where I quoted it, you'll notice that I put as my internal citation, Cordas et al., 2024, but I put the chapter heading because there's not a page number because I didn't download the book. I went to the website, but the title of the web page is Chapter 5.3, The Mercantilist Economy. So if I wanted to find it, I could go back to here, I could click on that website and then go to Chapter 5 and look at Section 5.3. And then the David Roediger piece, my multimedia, The Historical Foundations of Race, 2024, again, because the National Museum of African History and Culture updates itself regularly. The nmaahc.si, because it is a Smithsonian Institute Museum.edu and this is the actual link to the essay itself. All right, so that is discussion 3. Now, at this point, I am grading your discussion 3s for those of you who did it. Like I said, most of you did the CTE. I have also graded that first CTE for you, and those should have been returned at this point. And I've entered that CTE because it was required into the grade book online. If you also did discussion 3, I'm going to grade those and I will release them to you, but I'm not going to enter them in the grade book because for this week, for you guys, the CTE was required. Next week, week 4, when you had the choice between the CTE or the discussion, I'm still going to do a discussion of the discussion question, and I'll also talk about the CTE since it's an analysis of Harari, and that will be included in the presentation that I do because that's going to touch on either one, and I'll enter whichever one you did into the grade book for that week. If you did both, again, I'll only enter one of them, probably the one that has the highest point value for you, and I'll reserve the other one, though, in my grade book because I'm tracking both your CTEs and your discussions in my personal grade book because that will let me know what your 6 highest discussion grades are and your 4 highest CTE grades are, which are the ones that I'll be using in the final calculation of your grade. All right, so if you have any questions about this, email me. I will be returning the discussion post later this weekend so that you will have those as well. If you have any questions about economic changes, please let me know, and please be sure that you are including all of your required sources in your discussions and that you are posting them in a timely manner. Remember, top posts are still due on Thursday, so that you have 3 days between Thursday and Monday to do your peer comments, and the CTEs are due on Saturdays by midnight. So I tried to set those 2 days differently so you would have time to do both of them if you choose to do both of them. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.